Hey everyone, another special episode of Dilemma. Season 1 just was never meant to end, I guess, because the entire world has turned into an episode of Dilemma. So I'm coming to you from my pandemic hideaway, which is in Pennsylvania. This is a house that I didn't grow up in, but my parents got when I was in college, and here I am, and there's a bonsai tree, and doing well with the social distancing. Anyway, today I am talking to Amdana Ripley, who is a guest who I've been dying to reach out to. I'm a huge fan of her writing. She's a writer. She writes for The Atlantic now, and she's a best-selling writer. She wrote a book called The Unthinkable: Who Survives in a Disaster and Why, which is what this episode is obviously going to be about, because we are in a global disaster that is slowly unfolding. So we talk about The Unthinkable. It's an incredible book. She wrote, I think, in 2008. Everyone should go read it. She wrote another book that I'm a really big fan of called The Smartest Kids in the World, which is about education systems and why certain systems in certain countries seem to thrive. Fascinating book. I'm going to have her on in season 2 for a more normal episode. But for this episode, another sort of pandemic conversation. She is the guest, talking mostly about The Unthinkable, and I just recorded it, so I'm recording this after. We get into a lot of incredible topics about her work with covering disasters from tsunamis and previous pandemics like SARS and swine flu that she covered. She writes about things like stampedes at the Hajj, which is an incredibly chilling chapter, and plane crashes and who gets out of these things. And we draw analogies to the world that we're living in now. But then there's also a lot of practical advice about what we can do to sort of get through this on a personal level, because I think one thing that we all are aware of is there's this sort of global disaster that we're all living through, but then there's these personal little dilemmas that are just all over the place, which we might even feel kind of guilty about, wondering about, oh, poor me, I can't see my friends or go out drinking right now. And that seems a little callous to be saying or thinking about in the context of a global disaster where people, of course, are literally dying on large numbers. And perhaps it is on some level, but there are also real considerations to talk about and real problems for us to solve. And I think a source to find actually resilience that can even contend with and help us be better prepared to not just survive on a personal level, but communal level, the next disaster, whether that's a pandemic or whatever it happens to be. So we get into all that stuff. Enjoy it. Thank you for listening. And hopefully soon we're back to some sort of normalcy. We'll see where we come out on the other side. But here you go. Another episode of Dilemma that I was not expecting to make. And here it is. Thank you for being here. These are not normal times. I am here in my suburban life here in Pennsylvania. There's a bonsai tree over here that my mom has on the shelf. And that's where I'm doing this dispatch from. And you're in the mountains of Shenandoah, or you're in DC, sort of isolating.
Just outside of DC. Yep.
Yeah. And you wrote a book called The Unthinkable, now 12 years ago, that I obviously can't stop thinking about in this situation. The subtitle of the book is who survives in disaster and why.
Right.
And it talks about things like stampedes at the Hajj, which is a terrifying chapter for me, 9/11 stories, plane crashes, those kinds of disasters, tornadoes, Hurricane Katrina, this kind of stuff. And now we find ourselves in this global situation. I wanted to start by, are we in a disaster by your sort of framing, or what you learned while doing that book? Are we in a disaster? Does that count?
Definitely. So some disasters are slow motion disasters, and this is one of those. And so I don't think the behavior is radically different. It's different in some ways, right? But the scale of this, the level of dread, which is actually a technical term in research on disasters, all of those things I definitely put it in the category of a disaster.
Yeah. I wanted to start with a story from the book that I think is relevant, of Tillie Smith. You could tell her story. You're also just an amazing storyteller, not just a journalist. I love reading your book. It's just sort of a narrative structure is incredible. And you tell the story of Tillie Smith, who I'll let you'll tell. And then the analogies that I think might be interesting to parse here about why there was no Tillie Smiths here, or maybe there were a lot of them and we just didn't listen in the situation we find ourselves in with coronavirus. So who is Tillie Smith, if people don't know?
Yeah, so Tillie Smith is she was an English schoolgirl vacationing with her parents in Thailand in 2004. And they were walking on the beach when the tide suddenly rushed out, which is unusual. And the water just was behaving oddly, is very shallow, and tourists started pointing at the fish flopping around on the sand. Um, she was 10 years old, Tillie, and it happened that she had just learned about tsunami in her geography class at school just a couple weeks earlier. And she'd actually seen a video of a Hawaii tsunami and learned all the signs. So she told her parents, we have to get off the beach. I really think there's going to be a tsunami. And her parents, you know, initially were, as you might imagine, skeptical of this, but she was really adamant. So eventually her parents started warning people to leave the beach. And that's a difficult thing to do, to listen to a 10-year-old and take her seriously. And but I guess, she probably wasn't prone to making sort of empty threats like this. And so the father went up to the Marriott hotel where they were staying, and he happened to tell a staff member while another guy standing nearby, another tourist, overheard it. And he said, "Yeah, I heard there was a big earthquake not that long ago. Like, this is possible." So they ended up clearing the beach, and it was one of very few in that town where no one was killed or seriously hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an incredible story. She talked about like the water gets kind of frothy or something like a beer or something like that. And some geography teacher that I was looking up was the one who imparted this lesson. I mean, there's a lot of amazing analogies to talk about Tillie, but why I find it fascinating and interesting here is that it was and maybe it falls apart because it's sort of a physical warning that you could actually see. But even in a place like America, it's like here we are in the US and you sort of saw this tsunami coming in a wave of graphs that just seemed to just announce to everybody, this is coming, do something. There's nothing that's different about America really from Italy or from Spain or from all these places that we're seeing. They're just telling you like, hey, you're 9 days behind the graph in Italy. So do something. And it seemed like Tillie Smith, I'm just imagining this image of like the economists and the mathematicians running around America as little Tillie Smiths telling everybody to get off the damn beach. And then maybe morbid, literally people weren't getting off of beaches in Florida and California. And here we are. I mean, I guess that's why the analogy I think is interesting. I don't know if you've been thinking about her or other stories from that book.
Definitely. I mean, I think that we all have a tendency to first enter a phase of denial in any kind of disaster. So it could be literally a fire, an earthquake, a hurricane. It can be slow motion disasters like an economic crisis or a pandemic. The first phase is always, always, always the same, which is a period of profound disbelief in which most of us get really creative to come up with reasons for why this is probably no big deal. And there's really good reason for that, actually. Like, I don't blame us for that. And I think it's particularly tricky in a pandemic, and we can talk about that. But, unless you've had experience with an actual threat before in recent history and it's vivid, or you've had highly realistic simulation training, which is just as good, then you're unlikely, you have no like bucket to put this in your head, you have no slot, no like category for this. And so your brain naturally is going to try to fit it into everything that's happened to you before. And so that takes time to get through that phase, depending on, who you're getting your information from, who's around you, what kind of experience level other people have. And, you can see the difference, right? Like, despite all the problems that happened in China, in much of Asia, they had recent experience with pandemics like this, right? With SARS and other things. So once like they kind of realized what was happening, there was a pretty rapid response with some exceptions. So when you have experience, that's going to help you a lot. If you don't have experience, you got to have really good training. That's going to help you a lot. And there were people in the United States who had both of those things, who tried to kind of sound the alarm. And that's true in many other countries. But we do a lot of preparedness and drilling and simulation around pandemics. None is quite, nothing ever goes exactly the way you expect. I do think most people were pretty compliant. There were exceptions, right? But it's really hard to know the level of compliance when we have one camera looking at kids at spring break. That's not necessarily representative of most people, right?
Right.
And to be fair to those kids, like the warnings were saying this only affects you, if you're old. And then that data changed, right? So the information in any disaster is always really confusing and misleading, especially at first. And so pandemics are particularly, this pandemic is very tricky because there's so much uncertainty and it's such a moving target. So, when your brain encounters uncertainty and risk, you will always make decisions using emotion and you will use shortcuts to make decisions. So that means when there's a high level of uncertainty, which there was and is, you will always, almost always, either underreact or overreact or alternate between the two, which is, I think, kind of what I'm doing. I don't know about you, but some days I'm underreacting, some days I'm overreacting. So it's hard to get it just right.
Yeah, I was just rereading your chapter on panic, where this word overreaction sort of lives on the border of something called panic and what is panic. And when you talk about that, we're in a slow motion disaster. I think everything in your book, which again, we're all very, as far as I remember, like immediate disasters. These are things that are like very suddenly you're in a life or death situation. But the slow motion, you're right, doesn't seem to be actually changing any of the dynamics of it. You just actually get time to parse them. So something about, we could get into the panic and this notion of anger that comes up in a lot of in your book. And I'm thinking of now, people being angry at themselves, seeing images of those kids on the beach. I remember my girlfriend and I were watching Jake Tapper and Sanjay Gupta on CNN watch images of those kids and be sort of like infuriated by it. And again, thinking of the analogies in your book of something like a very fast motion thing, like trying to rush to the exit doors when you hear a loud sound. There was a story, you could tell the story of like this little pizza shop or something where they heard a loud bang in the basement. And that was kind of it. That's the entire issue. And then everyone starts to sort of go towards the doors and suddenly you're in this notion of panic, but people turn on each other in those moments. And some of our human psychology becomes very ugly in those moments of people pushing each other, punching each other, and some is very beautiful. I will also, before you answer sort of what I just threw at you, you do a great job in the book of not ever answering the question of who survives and why with any
sort of overarching "here's the answer,"
which is it's why it's a good book. I mean, I would hate it if you did because here's the key to survive. Of course, there's never one reason. But if you don't mind, sort of tell the story of that pizza shop because I think it's so relatable in such an awful way of our psychology that you tell it, but I could imagine doing something very stupid and ugly in the middle of a dumb panic trying to find the exit door in a pizza shop.
Yeah, no, it's really tricky because we use the word panic a lot in sort of normal conversation. It sort of in the disaster world, it technically means like aggressive antisocial misbehavior, right? So you can't really call buying toilet paper panic, right? Like it's not great because that means that other people can't get the toilet paper, buy a bunch.
They've started rationing it here in Pennsylvania, by the way. There's signs you can only buy one. Yeah.
So. Which just makes perfect sense and probably should have happened sooner. But that's not panic per se. Like panic is punching out people at the cash register, right? So you haven't seen a lot of that. Usually when it does happen in disasters, it's almost always exaggerated. So I've grown to be really, really skeptical of the first reports after any kind of disaster of like misbehavior, like looting or rioting. They almost always turn out to be like one guy with a big screen TV or two guys, like looting a shop. And it's never like at the scale we expect. There's a certain conditions that have to be present for looting and rioting to really take hold in a significant way. And those conditions are not usually present. I mean, the reality is, we're human beings. We need each other to survive after a disaster more than normal. So it's not like, rush hour on the freeway. It's a totally different set of emotions and needs and instincts when you're in during or after a disaster. And I think, to your point, a lot of disasters we think of traditionally are much faster, right? But probably the closest analogy, and I've written about swine flu and other things, but I feel like those are a little different. The closest analogy would be a hurricane, I think, because you get days of warning, and you have to rely on people to take action to evacuate or to stock up, or so there's maybe some interesting analogy there. But in general, people running for the exit when you think there's been a bomb that went off in the back is not rational, right? Like, so is that panic is sort of an interesting question. There are even the Hajj, you mentioned the stampedes at the Hajj, and this is sort of a recurring problem. It's happened in, soccer stadiums around the world, big rock concerts, other venues where people are all trying to get out and there's a crowd crush. And that too is usually a problem of physics. Like there's literally a sort of shock wave that happens through the crowd, and the people in back can't see the people in front who have fallen down, right? So anyway, we can get more into that. But I used to hear this as a reporter, like, oh, panic never happens. And I didn't believe it, because that sounds like something academics say, right? Like, like, oh no, people are good, and you're like, really? Like, we don't believe it. But having covered a bunch of different kinds of disasters, I'm not saying that people don't misbehave or make ill-informed decisions. For sure that happens. And that, by people, I would definitely include people in charge and reporters and politicians. Like, those people do a lot of sketchy things, and often not knowingly, but sometimes knowingly. And so I'm not saying that people are like good, always. It's just that the sort of cinematic scene that we have in our heads of panic is unusual.
Yeah. And we don't have to name names, but we certainly could. But with this notion of ignoring warnings and using your priors, remembering the last hurricane that you lived through just fine, so you're not going to flee this time. You tell the story, I forget his first name, Turner, I think it was his last name, a guy who tried to sort of wait it out, I think with a crucifix and a baseball bat was the name of that chapter, through Hurricane Katrina. Unfortunately did not make it out. But it was, you're sort of giving him the understandable, like, well, the last 3 times they told me to leave, I stayed and I was fine, so I'm going to stay. That problem seems like such a tricky problem about trust, clearly. Trust in institutions and trust in warning signs, trust in the media, which maybe people have as a very all-time low, about crying wolf and overreacting. To every election that I've ever lived through was the most important election to ever vote in, and life and death depends on it. And then you start to sort of lose trust that the next one, when they tell you this one is really the big one, you're like, well, that's what you said every time, and you just want my money and you want me to tune in. I don't know how we solve that problem, but it's obviously decisive when it comes to who lives and dies, and even things like a plane crash. If you trust the stewardess or whoever takes charge with the exit plan, I don't know how to solve this problem. I don't know if you've thought about it. Like the erosion of trust on little things. You write a lot, of course, about 9/11 quite a bit, and we all know now that there was early recommendations when people would call 911 to just stay where you are and wait it out, someone's coming. And people who followed it, like, we all know that story, that if you followed that, you died, which wasn't a huge number. And like you said, those all get exaggerated, I think. I didn't know the number before I read your book, of the percentage of people below where the planes hit that actually lived was quite high. It was only a few, like 100 something deaths underneath that. But those stories stick out, and I don't know how to solve it, but it seems like nobody knows who to trust right now. The CDC is saying wear masks, then they say don't wear masks. Everyone's getting a lot of weird information. And then the lack of trust, it seems like we have a lot of nefarious actors who step into those places, and I don't know. I just threw a lot at you. I'm just dismayed.
I think you're onto something really important. I think if I wrote the book again now, I would talk a lot more about trust. And, from my, like the Unthinkable, which came out in 2008, was, very influenced by the disasters I had covered. So Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, anthrax, things like that. But the sort of the thing that got me interested in writing it was because I was covering all these disasters for Time magazine, and over again, the people who had survived these disasters had really important and surprising and useful lessons to tell, and they weren't making it into our bigger conversations about policy or emergency preparedness. So these survivors had like these incredible amounts of wisdom, right? You think about it, millions of Americans evacuate for hurricanes every year. Like they know what to take with you, what not to take. Like they know a lot, right? But they're very rarely asked in any systematic way for their opinion. So the book was really an attempt to say, hey, what can we learn from these people that we don't already know? And there's a lot that they want you to know. Like they're, people who have been through these things have a lot that they wish they had known. And so the reason I say that is just to turn the question upside down. So we do have a huge trust deficit in our society right now. And it is a massive, massive problem. I think about it all the time with regards to my own profession of journalism. I think it's a huge problem, and we're seeing the effects of it now. We're seeing the effects of it. We will be seeing the effects of it for years to come. I also think that the biggest solution to that is that the people in charge and the institutions need to trust the public. So it's not just about how can we get the public to trust, journalists again, or to trust institutions or government. And so people in charge always underestimate the public before and during disasters. And it's a huge, systemic, predictable failure. And there are psychological, understandable reasons for that. But that's like the mechanism, the trigger that I would really try to work on is not just we have to work on like, how can we get people to trust institutions again? But those institutions have to be trustworthy. And one way that you get trust is by giving it, right? So it's sort of like in journalism, the analogy is some of the most innovative newsrooms, and most of these are local newsrooms, and there aren't many, but the most innovative ones are really trying to give readers and their audiences way more influence over what stories they do, how they do them, questions they want answered, like be much more transparent. Sometimes they deputize people, residents in the town to help them go through huge data sets, and they train them up to do that. And just really trying to say, hey, you guys live here. We don't know everything as the reporters in town. We've spent many years telling you what you need to know. And now we want to just kind of give up some of that control and that sense that we know better. And that doesn't mean that we don't do stories we think are important or that we're not independent and ethical and all those things. But I think that's a really to me, a really promising way to try to build back some trust. And it has to do with giving trust to the public. So already we've seen, you see this in every disaster. It's like totally predictable that people in charge underestimate the public. So they say stupid things like, don't panic or, stay calm. These are like just ridiculous things to say. And it happens over and over again. So the best public officials and politicians and emergency managers are ones who trust the public and deputize the public because they are the only ones who will be there to get you out of this. Like that, there's no better example, right, than this pandemic. Like we need extraordinary public cooperation to contain this. And so you have to treat people like grownups, like you really do. And you have to give them information, tell the truth, always, always, always admit what you don't know, be very explicit about what you thought yesterday, and now you have new information, to your point, because it's always changing. And so you really have to treat people, you have to have the same conversations with the public that you have with your, family and friends over dinner. Like they can't be different.
Yeah, and it seems, I'm trying to, again, use these analogies to like the immediate disasters of trying to escape a plane that crashed and those kind of things. And I think they're all still there. I remember, I'm skipping a little ahead of my notes, but I remember reading your book and noticing everything I was seeing wrong with warning signs, because they said dumb stuff like don't panic or stay calm, or these like trite things that actually don't mean anything. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were advocating for and still advocate for very specific, deliberate information. Tell people the numbers of things and trust them that they will respond to it. And actually, I don't know if this was your doing. You could tell me if you. I started seeing ads on the subway from the MTA that were suddenly very specific after I read your book. I don't know if they read it too. That would just said like 8 people died by stepping into the tracks last year. Be careful. Like it was, and suddenly it was very specific, not just like stay behind the yellow line. It was like, here's the situation. And yes, yeah, it was. I think it was an improvement. I don't know how their numbers have gone, but you should. If I'm doing this also video, you can put up these graphics that I have. They're very direct and sort of like alarming ads. It's stick figures, but they still like get the point across. But when things change, so like the CDC 10 days ago saying like you shouldn't wear masks, and now they might change that or something like that. I'm imagining if I was in a plane that crashed and we're trying to get to the exits and there's smoke filling up or whatever, and then I'm somewhere back in the line, and then someone up in the front says, "Oh, we can't use this exit anymore," but doesn't tell me why. I don't know. I might panic or I might freak out or try to get to it. But if they say like, "Oh, there's a fire at this exit, we're all going to shift to the left one," there is this kind of docile thing that people fall into. And I don't know, you tell me if I'm wrong, but it's almost this trance state that you just sort of oblige because you fall into that. So if the CDC gave us the reason of, oh, things have changed and this is why we're doing the mask advice right now, that's what you mean. I guess I'm really asking you, like, what are we doing wrong? What should the experts be saying right now, or the people we need to trust to do the thing you just said and empower the public?
So I recently talked to Baruch Fishoff, who's at Carnegie Mellon, who studied risk communication for many, many years. Really thoughtful, smart guy. And he said that the biggest mistake he's seeing is that the language is really sloppy. So the best way that public warnings can be issued is you have to test them first. Like you can't use your intuition. So all of us think that we're better communicators than we are. And it turns out that people don't always hear what you think, that people have questions you haven't thought of, that people may not they may not trust you for various reasons. They may need to know why, to your point. They almost always want to know why, and it's very rarely included. So this step is really critical, and it's different. Risk communication is different than PR, right? So when you deal with high-level politicians, it's PR people who are writing those talking points, right? And that's very different than a risk communications person who will know that you need to test that message, even if it's literally with 5 people. If it's a diverse group of people who represent your audience, then or your community or whatever, that's great. Much better to say, hey, what do you think if we say this about the masks, what do you hear? Like, what else do you want to know? Like, what would you do based on this information? And it takes like 15 minutes, and the public is grateful to be asked. Like those 5 people are like, and they will go tell their friends, hey, guess what happened? And the same problem with public health officials. So they've done, Herculean work, but it is not typically in their toolbox to test their messages. They think they're being super clear, right? And this happens again and again. Like the best example of this, I mean, there's so many, but when they talk about like categories of hurricanes, right? Oh no, this is even better. This is my favorite. When you get like a text message or an alert that says tornado warning, right? There's different levels of jargon that only
watch then
tornado watch versus warning, right? And those both start with a W and sound the same to humans, right? To regular people. But the people in charge of warnings know that there's a big difference between a tornado watch and a tornado warning, but that doesn't matter. Like the warning isn't for them. And journalists do this too. We write things that we understand, right? So anytime you're ignorant of anyone in your audience, which is always, you're going to miscommunicate, you're going to be misunderstood, you're not going to be trusted. So you really have to test those warnings. And that's something that I've been writing a couple of Washington Post columns lately about coronavirus. And I'm glad I got to tell you, Jay, because that got cut from the piece because we didn't have space. But
Yeah.
I do think that's a really important thing that doesn't actually take that long. But again, it goes to trusting the public. They are your allies, right? They're not the enemy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, are there lessons from the specific disasters you covered about who survived and didn't in things like plane crashes? I didn't. So the numbers in that book are also pretty, some of them are really encouraging because I don't know what the audience in their heads right now, if you haven't read Amanda's book, how many people do you think actually die in plane crashes when the plane goes down? Whatever number's in your head, the real number is what? 56%? That's it?
Yeah, most people survive. Most plane
56%
crashes are survivable. Yeah. So
which like you would never know from watching Hollywood movies or anything else.
Like that's going down. There's nothing you can do.
And again, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems it's not like an all or nothing thing, but some plane crashes sort of inexplicit. Well, there's explanations, I guess, but you open the door and it's like everyone died, and then everyone lives. So that number that you come out with about half and half really is almost the like you're on the right plane or the wrong plane. Like what's different about the planes that do it really well versus don't? And can we, I know there's a lot of other variables of physics and if you happen to hit a mountain versus the whatever, but are there lessons there about the communication in the moment of how you're going to get off that plane quickly that we can learn here? Like you're trying to say, I don't know who does the messaging,
Yeah, so I think you're asking like if everything else is constant, like the physics of the crash, chemistry, then what matters, right? What makes the difference? And there are definitely things that matter. So the most common mistake that actually all animals, but let's just talk about humans. Humans make in disasters. Another show. We'll talk about other animals.
Yeah, other animals in disasters. Well, you write about cow stampedes too, which is fascinating. But go on, yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. But for another time. So humans, the most common mistake is not panic. It's what the airlines call negative panic. So it's literally the opposite. It's not fight or flight. It's freezing, shutting down, not moving at all. And this is a state that any animal can get into if they're scared enough. It seems to be evolutionarily valuable in certain situations that almost never happen to humans today. But if you're playing dead, like playing possum, right? That expression, that may not be a terrible decision in one in every 5 billion situations. So right now, most threats, you need to act, you need to move. So what they've learned with airplane crashes, and the reason I talk about airplane crashes, just to like be clear, is that because they're really not dangerous. Like it's not a real threat for most people, but people study the crap out of them, right? Because they're such a deal breaker for the industry. So they have psychologists, they they study everything about the forensics and the human behavior on plane crashes is really well studied. As opposed to other much more common threats. So it's useful as a laboratory. And what they found is that you can break through, so in most plane crashes, the plane ends up on the ground and on fire. So you have seconds before that smoke is just too toxic to survive because of the chemicals that you're breathing in. So the whole game is to get off quickly. Now here's the problem in a lot of plane crashes, to your point. They put out the fire and they go on board and they would see people with their seatbelts on, their hands crossed in their lap, and there was no one had moved, right? And that was just chilling and tragic, right? So what they found is that when people get into this kind of trance, right, when they're very frightened and they have no realistic training or experience for that situation, so both those things, frightened, very frightened, and no experience for how to get off and how to, know muscle memory for this situation. That's where you tend to sort of shut down and freeze. And what happens though, just like with other animals, a loud sound can actually snap you out of that really easily. So they started training flight attendants to literally scream at you to get out of the plane, right? And rescuers of different kinds do this too. I mean, I did some training with flight attendants for the book, and it's a little unnerving, because normally they hopefully don't scream at you, but when in these mock-ups, the cabin would fill with non-toxic smoke, and they're yelling at you, like, unbuckle your seatbelt, get off the plane. and it works. Like, people become super compliant in these situations because they need to. Like, people become very social in disasters because they need the group and they don't know what to do. And so if there is a commanding presence,
You just hope like Nicolas Cage is on your plane somewhere just yelling at everybody.
Yeah, just hope that Nick Cage knows what he's doing, right?
Yeah,
because people will also follow you into doom. Like that's the problem. So, but yeah, aggressive leadership is very effective in those situations. Also, training. So, people who study plane crashes have proposed in the past that they should, like, in airports, put a mock-up of a plane cabin, right, in the airport, and you could practice getting out, like going down those slides, but of course the airlines don't want to do that because they don't want to go near. They don't trust you, basically, right? Like, they don't want to talk about crashing because then you might not fly. So, but any kind of experience you have evacuating a building or preparing for something, the more quickly you'll probably move through that phase.
Yeah. I think this is on topic. My next question was going to be about this notion of spectacle, and obviously airlines. The spectacle of a plane crash is big. We all see it on the news, and so we tend to then overestimate how frequent they happen, all that kind of stuff. And so, like you're saying, the airline then wants to eliminate all of them. But in the instance we're in now, I have this question in my mind that I can't shake. I'm a filmmaker. You're in media. It's sort of similar kind of ideas. And about communication, I keep wondering if this moment, that we're still in, needs a poster or an image to shake people in that way that the stewardess yelling at you of like, do something right now. I think of images. We did an episode in season 1 with Larissa McFarker about a famous photo of the vulture behind a starving child in Sudan that made the front page of every newspaper in the 90s and sparked this action to end the famine in Sudan. The Napalm Girl photo that we all know, which was actually a film still from Vietnam. The dead boy, the Syrian refugee who washed up. We all know the photos, and we know the crisis now has a poster. I don't know how useful they are, but they're emotionally sort of enrapturing. I don't know if this moment has a photo. Does it need a photo? Does it need a poster? Does that actually help? Am I looking for the wrong thing? I actually don't know if it would help. Yeah. There's one. I mean, there's a couple candidates that I think are floating out there. One thing that seems to catch on is nurses holding up signs or something that read, what is it? We're staying late. Please stay home for us. That, I don't know if you've seen that going around, which is a nice message. But I don't know if it's jarring enough. And this points to Paul Bloom wrote the book Against Empathy that made the very seemingly obvious point of you could read that 100,000 people died of coronavirus yesterday, but it's so much less effective than seeing one photo or video of a old man starving for his last breath of air while his family cries behind a pane of glass and can't comfort him in his last moments. Like, some people can multiply that one instance by 100,000 when they just see the number, but most of us can't. So I don't know. As members, I mean, you're much more in the media. I'm independent. Like, how do you do that? Like, what am I looking for the wrong thing here for coronavirus?
So if I'm understanding you, you're saying that you don't feel like people are you saying that you don't feel like people are taking this seriously enough, and that maybe a really vivid, compelling image would help people take it seriously? Is that right?
Some people maybe. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to grasp if people are generally or if people aren't. It is and we haven't really talked about the wicked problem that we're in of this one, where you kind of need everyone to play along because just one person can kind of spoil the whole thing. I mean, there's a lot of particular dangers with a pandemic, but let's even just say someone in your family's not taking it seriously or just doesn't, I mean, do they need an image?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah. So, cause it's important, I think, to kind of separate out the categories, right? Like, you could sort all people into like 20 different categories right now of people who are too afraid, like they're past a point where they're able to make good decisions, and the anxiety and fear have a really strong negative health effect. We know that, right? So that's counterproductive, right? And then, so those people, you don't want to show them an image necessarily, right? Like that's not helpful.
Yeah.
And then you have like all the way, like many categories between that extreme and people who just think the whole thing is a hoax and aren't doing anything and are maybe intentionally sort of, and that's a very small number of people who are intentionally violating the directives in a kind of flagrant, reckless way, right? Like that's a small number of people from everything we can see so far. It's again hard to know, but so you get this whole spectrum. So let's talk about maybe someone who is maybe not taking it as seriously. They're doing things that they don't need to do that put themselves or others at risk, right? And probably we all know someone who'd fall into that category. So the most salient thing I think that will happen with this, it may be an image, but it'll probably be a person. And it'll probably, I hate to say this, it's kind of morbid, but it'll almost certainly be a famous person who dies from this, right?
Yeah.
So it's like a kind of an awful thing to say, but I do think that once a celebrity or someone from your town or someone, just today I saw a headline in the Washington Post. I live in DC that said an aide to the mayor had died of the coronavirus. I don't know this person. I don't know the mayor, right? But it did it had a salience for me that was higher than reading 100,000 deaths, which I know is crazy, right? Like I know that's irrational, but like I'm human, right? So anytime you know someone who knows someone who knows someone, but I think probably a famous, high profile person, that death will really hit home. But we also have to remember that we had a pre-existing condition before this pandemic, and that was the political polarization in this country, which is what I'm very focused on for the stuff I normally write about these days. But that is everyone is viewing this event through those lenses. So you do see a differential in how seriously Republicans are taking this versus Democrats, how people feel about the news media, um, very much informed by their pre-existing emotion regarding politics. Now, again, most people are not on those extremes. Most people are kind of the exhausted majority of Americans who are not particularly partisan, but very vocal people, many of them highly educated and influential, are extremely partisan, and they are not seeing this the same way, depending on where they land on the political spectrum. So that is, I think that will continue to distort our response and the narrative that we create for how this went down.
Yeah, I used to, I think, be a little more optimistic at the beginning of this thing that we were gonna avoid some of the partisanship, but it seems my optimism has run dry very quickly. When you mentioned like a risk communicator versus a PR person, I mean, all right, I'm no Trump fan. I don't know how you feel, but it seems like Trump is the PR person up there. His whole life has been a PR campaign for himself. And Dr. Fauci or these other people who seem to be up there trying to be these communicators to us are bless him, trying to be a risk communicator. It just seems so stark, the difference between the two of them. You don't have to name names about Trump.
Well, even like you're seeing the reaction to Fauci now. There's people on the again highly partisan. This is a small number of people on the right who think that Fauci's out to get Trump, right? That this whole thing is designed to take Trump down, and it's like I do think we have to remember that we are all, including Fauci, everyone is making decisions based on emotion. None of us are like objective seers of what's happening here. This is a highly unpredictable event. So it is hard to not let emotion creep in, and we should just be honest about that, right? Like the problem is, yeah, you're right. There was a moment. I do think with every kind of intractable conflict I've studied, when there's a big disruption, there's an opportunity.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity to heal some of this divide, right? Because we do have a common enemy now.
Yeah.
That's very clear. Like if it weren't clear before, we have one. And there was an opportunity, particularly at the national level, to seize that moment and say, you know what? We are all in this together. Not just we Americans, but the entire globe has a common enemy, and it's this virus. And if we all join arms, there's nothing we can't do. And we know that, right? So there was an opportunity. There still may be opportunities, particularly at the state and local level. I do think a lot of state and locals are working across big political and racial and religious divides and other divides. So, I haven't lost all hope, but I do think in most of these situations, the conflict acts as a system, and the system has a lot of sort of positive feedback loops that just keep going and going and going, and it's hard to disrupt those. So that system's kind of clicked back into place.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, are there any disasters that you've studied where that window actually was somewhat permanent? The window of we're all in this together, and
You mean where it endured?
Yeah, where it endured long after. I'll tell a very brief story. It's on my mind being here in Allentown. After 9/11, I grew up in not this house in particular. My parents moved here when I was in college, but in this sort of liberal household, very democratic household. There were no George W. Bush fans, but after 9/11, in that spirit of sort of common enemy, and we're all in this together, we're all sort of drunk off of the common humanity of cheering for firefighters as they're coming out of the rubble and ambulances. And there's a little bit of that happening now. I mean, the video of people cheering out of their windows and in Europe is gorgeous. And in the midst of that sort of feeling, my parents put up an American flag outside of our garage. We're not a family who had ever done anything like that kind of thing. Within, I think it was 2.5, 3 weeks, they took down the flag because it felt like within 2.5, 3 weeks, the flag, maybe longer, maybe a month or two, the flag was sort of owned in a partisan conversation of the with us or against us, supporting the action of military movement in the Middle East and then eventually Iraq, where I think that's persisted to now, but within a year of 9/11, if you were on the highway and driving behind someone and you saw a bumper sticker of an American flag, and I had to put a gun to your head and ask you who they voted for, your answer would have been George W. Bush. It's probably Donald Trump today. And that was heartbreaking for me. I remember the moment after 9/11 was one of the first moments. I was in college, but one of the first moments in my life I actually felt this sort of swarm of, I don't know, patriotism or nationalism in a positive way of we are in this together. I remember going to baseball games after baseball came back, the kind of ceremonies that felt common. And now, as an analogy, maybe I'll go and take a photo of it just down the street here at a Hess Windows store. There's a little family-owned place here that I drive by all the time. They have an Earth flag flying right now that I think they just put up. And that seems to go to your point of maybe the window's already closing, but I don't know. I guess I'm asking you to give me an ounce of hope that window is not slammed shut yet. Maybe our priors in this country were just too broken, and now it's being exposed that it was never really going to open here. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people who are like the term of art. I actually think it's a really good phrase, and I think about it a lot. Is conflict entrepreneurs, like people who exploit conflict, and they do it for their own emotional needs or for their own profit, like profiteering, price gouging, that kind of thing. They do it for different reasons. You see it with like pundits on TV, like they intentionally sort of inflame division instead of the opposite, even when there are these openings, right? Right now, those conflict entrepreneurs have the biggest microphones in not just the United States, but many countries. And we've built platforms that actually amplify that kind of exploitation of conflict, right? So reward it. And there's not currently a huge disincentive for that kind of exploiting of conflict and aggravating of tension and friction and blame and shame, right? On any side, like left or right. So we need to change those norms and design different platforms. And these are bigger problems, right? But I do think it's hard in that climate to be louder than the conflict entrepreneurs, right? That said, at a national level, right? But that said, I think there's absolutely an opportunity at the local level. So I personally have seen this every disaster I've covered, and I've learned, and I felt this right away with this one. There is this window that has opened for every single one of us, right? To check in on our neighbors, right? To reach out to a friend or a family member we haven't talked to in a long time. Like I personally really have mourned the loss of the telephone as a device that people use to talk to one another. Like we know from all the research that talking, the way you and I are talking, with or without video, is infinitely richer and more meaningful and satisfying than texting or emailing, right? And yet we've let it go for lots of reasons. So this is this great moment where I can call my friends on the phone or on FaceTime, and they're not like, "What's wrong? Is there an emergency?" Like, "Why are you calling me, fool?" So there's this real opportunity to build some resilience with your friends and your neighbors and strangers, like, really. And you see it in a million ways. I don't have to list them for you, but I mean, even in my little neighborhood in DC, there's like all the stuff that's been started where you can volunteer to help local businesses that might need help surviving, like with all kinds of, whether you have, you know, PR skills or social media skills or accounting skills. And so there's like a lot of things that open up, right? Just as things close and all these things have been canceled and closed because of this thing, there are these openings, and you really have to. I really am trying. I don't always succeed, but I'm really trying to lean into those. And you end up meeting and forming relationships with, even if they're over FaceTime or Skype or whatever. You meet people and form relationships with people you would not be able to do that normally. So there's like a way to really build resilience, which is more meaningful from a human point of view, and also makes us stronger for the next thing that comes along.
Yeah. Well, amen to that. I mean, and then again, in your experience, are there communities or stories where they've been through this before and they actually just keep kind of getting better at it? I mean, just yesterday, my girlfriend and I were biking around here, and we went to this old flour mill that is just in the middle of nowhere in Allentown. And it was, we met a guy who was from the family. He ended up giving us sort of a tour. We kept our distance, but it was really kind of an amazing moment. But one of the stories in it was this flour mill called Haynes's Flour Mill, if anyone looks it up. It burned down at some point in like 1900 or the 1800s or something. And then he was telling us about the rebuild, and he kept emphasizing in the rebuild, all of these safety measures and measures they put in place to not let it ever burn down again. Like they put lightning rods up, and they had a different policy about the kind of grain that they would, because I think the grain jamming the gears was what caused the fire, all kinds of things. That place was never going to burn down again. And you could tell like that was 100 something years ago. And it's a local story, but you could obviously extrapolate that to, one story that I wrote about recently was, and we've talked about it already, Hurricane Katrina and Memorial Hospital. We actually did an episode on that as well, the awful triage situation happened there. Well, New Orleans, after the floodwaters receded and they were sort of back to some normalcy, built a $1.1 billion hospital for that neighborhood that is like built to withstand 200 mile per hour winds and would easily survive 3 Katrinas in a row right now. And that's sort of like, okay, we can learn from these things. But I don't know if this is a dress rehearsal. What are we learning right now that we can keep? I mean, with the resiliency, it'd be nice to keep that we need each other for the next pandemic. All the messaging, I don't know, what can we learn?
Yeah, I mean, I love the flour mill example that you gave. I think that's a really good one. What you find is that if people go through disasters or, emergencies or difficult periods, even in their own lives, maybe a depression, sickness, if they're able to recover. So chronic strain is really hard, right? Because you can't recover. If you're able to recover and you have the support to get to a place of normalcy and safety, relatively speaking, then often I do see communities come back stronger and individuals come back stronger. If people who are depressed get good counseling and good meds and the support they need, there's like a real insight that can happen for people about what their past traumas, about how they live their lives, how they want to live their lives. And the same is true for communities. I think part of it depends on whether how the duration, which is one of the challenges with this one, because you can't just kind of chronically be carrying a huge amount of trauma without it having kind of really lasting effects. But the duration is important. And then also, I think leadership is really important. Like, what is the story we are going to tell ourselves about this?
Yeah.
And not to say that story should be fabricated, but we know from all the literature that the way you frame these things for yourselves and your loved ones and your community really matters and how you think about it. So an example that is in The Unthinkable is a guy named Rick Rescorla, who managed security for Morgan Stanley Dean Witter in the World Trade Center. And he was one of these guys who really believed in regular people's, not just their ability to do good work in under strain in a disaster, but also the necessity. He knew that you couldn't just wait for someone to come rescue you in a disaster. So he did go through a very disturbing disaster he was also a Vietnam veteran, but in the World Trade Center, in his job, the first bombing, right? He was very worried about the vulnerability of the garage in the World Trade Center. Like he had warned the Port Authority that you could just drive a truck bomb into that garage and blow it up, and that's what happened, right before 9/11. And the evacuation was a disaster. Like, it took forever. The stairways were full of smoke. Like, it was just, even though it was a much smaller scale incident than 9/11, it was really disappointing to him, and he felt like everyone had failed. So there's an example where, he'd gone through something pretty awful, and you could have, um, quit or gotten discouraged, or, just kind of been like angry and grumpy for years to come. But instead, he really seized that and was incredibly visionary about making sure that everyone at Morgan Stanley knew how to get out of that building, and literally ran them through surprise fire drills where they had to walk downstairs. That never happened in the World Trade Center and almost never happens anywhere today. So having the muscle memory for where the stairwell is and going down some stairs and seeing how long that takes and really taking ownership, taking initiative, not waiting for someone to come. Those were things that he really drilled into people. And it was not popular, I should say.
Right.
Like the high net worth banker at Morgan Stanley did not like being interrupted to go for a fire drill, right? Like, that was not, but he had the credibility and he had the guts and he had the experience to know what people were capable of and what was necessary. So there's an example of building a culture of resilience that, really affected how things went on 9/11. On 9/11, everyone in Morgan Stanley knew where the stairwells were, and they evacuated right away. He didn't even have to tell them to do it.
Yeah.
And even the visitors, like there's like stockbroker training class that was happening. Rick had a rule that you had to be shown where the stairwell was the first day of your visit. So they all knew where it was, which is really, I mean, just again, never happens. So when the tower collapsed, only 13 Morgan Stanley employees, including Rick, were inside, and the other 2,687 were safe. So Rick had gone back in because he knew there were some stragglers, but 2,687 were safe, and they were high in the tower. So it was a really big deal. But that's an example of going through a disaster and becoming stronger, particularly by trusting regular people and training them.
Yeah. And on this topic of training and sort of simulating disasters, while writing the book, you went through a lot of these yourself, which was sort of funny to like read along with you putting yourself in the guinea pig seat. But obviously the challenge of simulating a disaster you tell me if it's surmountable to actually simulate something like life or death. There was a funny story you were trying to do or you were relaying of, I think it was airlines again, trying to simulate this notion of panic towards the exit, and they just couldn't figure out how to do it in a lab and the numbers seemed very low to me, but then they said first person out gets $10 or something like that. And then they kind of did it because they incentivized getting first. And then there was suddenly this urgency and people breaking the rules to get out first. Can you simulate disasters to a degree where really it reminds me of the famous Mike Tyson, the wonderful philosopher and boxer Mike Tyson, who said everybody has a plan till you get punched in the face. It seems like that's what a disaster is, of like, oh, I know how to do this, and then suddenly you're like smoke, fire, earthquake. I have no idea what I'm doing, but yeah, like how do you prepare for these things? Maybe we're all going through a slow one here in the pandemic.
I'm really wishing I had quoted Mike Tyson in the book.
You got it. There's a bunch of great Mike Tyson quotes, but most of them aren't very kosher. But yeah,
man, I like that one. So I do think there's two things you can do, right? Train for things that are most likely to happen. Mm-hmm. So if you live in Portland, Oregon, you're going to want to prepare for an earthquake, right? So those are the things, like there are certain risks that are just more likely to happen in certain places than others. Florida, California, there's certain things, and certain states are much better at this. Like California is very good at emergency preparedness in general, right? So that's the one thing, is like, think about where you live, what your risks are, what's most likely to happen. And like, so fire is something that is a good thing to train for, that will be useful, and you can make it kind of fun, but it's mostly like about, I was like the nerd kid who was like 9 years old making my parents do a fire drill. So kids are very good at this, and that's why firefighters visit classrooms, because they know the kids are really good evangelists. And it doesn't have to be like scary or miserable, and it can be kind of fun. And I still remember, because my dad, he was supposed to be the fire, right? So we were all in different rooms, and he came in. I was like, fire. And I immediately like jumped up from the kitchen table and like ran to this window. I was trying to like open the window so I could jump out. And my brother just kind of looked at me, and he like got up from the couch and walked out the door, right? And I was like, oh, that's smart. Yeah, I'm going to do that.
The door.
Door. So yeah, that's a good one. We know certain things, like most fires happen at night. It's good to do it, at night, but whatever. But the other thing is, some of these skills do transfer. So you probably won't practice for the exact thing, right? Like that happens. But some of them do transfer, particularly the community building ones. So there's a story in the book about a little town in California that decided to do a tsunami drill. And they weren't sure that, anyone would come or what would happen. And people got super into it, like kids brought their pets, their stuffed animals. And when they got to the evacuation point, which was in high ground, they had a little like clock you could punch to see how long it took you. And just so you'd have that memory, like, oh man, last time this happened, it took me like 7 minutes. And, if there's a warning, I won't have that much time, whatever. So that was useful. But the thing that was cool is, like, after the drill, everybody hung out and was just like talking and chatting and laughing, and it became like a community building event. So the next time something happens there, let's say they do these drills every year or whatever, then you have this, even if it's not a tsunami, right? Let's say it's an earthquake. Let's say it's a pandemic, right? All those things you do build connectivity in that community, a sense of solidarity, a sense of knowing who needs help. That's a big thing, right? Like knowing who's the person who's in a wheelchair and is going to need to be carried. And so those are things that you learn, that are, some of them are really pragmatic, and some of them are a little more undefinable, right? Like just the quality of relationships that build from those experiences.
This one seems particularly challenging because of it. You covered SARS, you said, or which pandemic, and Ebola, and like the whole
swine flu, like ones that really were more in the U.S.
Yeah, because with this one, it's the people who need help sometimes are the ones who you're told to stay far away from. I'm thinking of like old people who are lonely, and now we all have to stay away from them. They were already kind of neglected in society before, and now it's like you can wave. Riding my bike yesterday, I was waving at this older woman in a wheelchair, and that's feels like kind of the best you could do now. I mean, I don't know, in the other pandemics that you saw this sense of solidarity, but having this to be physically separate from someone. I don't know, like you said, Skyping and video messaging is bridging the gap somehow. But
it's really diabolical, isn't it?
Like, yeah, it's really crappy. It's
I keep calling. We have an elderly neighbor. I keep calling her. Well, I've called her like a couple. My husband's called her. I've called her, and every time she's like, "Yeah, nothing's changed for me, Amanda. Like I'm 95. I'm home alone all day." Yeah. And it's sort of sad because it's like, man, you're right. Like you were isolated before this, and now I'm calling you and offering to buy you groceries. Is that really what you need? Like,
right. And why didn't you call 2 months ago?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of like guilt happening.
Yeah. It's unsatisfying. Like I think she's fine to have us check in, but is that really the need? And so there is something diabolical, which is why like I did this piece in the Post about this. Like I really think that just like if suddenly there were no sun, we would all take vitamin D. You have to supplement you have to take a supplement. Like you can't do this physical distancing thing and then like behave the same way. Like we know that the effects of this, not just on other people, but on ourselves, are really unhealthy over time, especially. So like you have to exercise more than you normally do if you can. I know that's not easy if you're trying to take care of kids or you have health issues, whatever. But like if you can possibly exercise, you should look at that as like required, like, and whether you do it in home or outside, doesn't matter. But that's a way that you compensate for the deleterious effects of stress and isolation and anxiety. So it's literally a direct hit for so many of the things and boost your immune system and all that so that you can be helpful to people around you. And then, another thing is talking, like we're talking, like really talking to other people once a day at least, whether it's on the phone or WhatsApp or whatever. And then also trying to do some small act of kindness for someone else. So get out of your own head, do some small thing, whether it's checking on a neighbor or, if you can, donating to a local business or, there's a list of all the waiters and baristas in DC going around, and you can give them a tip via Venmo or even if it's $1, like, so that feels good. And obviously it's nice, but like it also, again, in the research has this effect of decreasing your stress, boosting your immune system. So you can make a very clear scientific argument for why we need to be doing more socially, not less.
Yeah. To your sun analogy, it's like if the sun went out and you took the supplement and then the sun came back on, maybe you would appreciate it more. It's one of those, to quote the other philosopher, Joni Mitchell, don't know what you got till it's gone. I don't know the whole the whole song or the whole quote. But I hope if we're missing each other with the social distancing thing, hopefully we'll remember that when we're given the thumbs up and able to actually hug each other again. Maybe we'll remember how much we missed, saying hi to the grocer or whatever who sells us our stuff. You hope that sort of lasts.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that because I do worry about like which of these habits will stick, like after the '08 recession, we saw companies, had hired a lot of temp workers because of the financial insecurity and uncertainty. And then they discovered, hey, guess what? This works for us. Like it's cheaper for us. So those full-time jobs, a lot of them never came back. Right. And we've seen the consequences of that on wages and other things and benefits. So there's certain things we don't want to stick. We don't want people to be like, well, I guess we don't have to meet in person, like, well, I guess,
Right.
so I think it's good to be like aware of those and again, really leaning into this, like this, I tried to get it's not working at all. But I tried on Twitter to get the phrase social closening like to be trending. It's such an awkward word, but that's a real word. It turns out, like closening. So,
what do you want it to mean? I could help out.
Okay, yeah. It's like if you're going to do physical distancing, you have to do social closening. It's like chocolate chip cookies and milk. Like you just can't do one. So like you have to do them together. And maybe there's a better word. Like closening is weird, but yeah, I'm sure there is.
But you want it to mean like video, like call your friends.
Like more connectivity, I actually have to go in a few minutes because I'm doing a Zoom happy hour, and it's like with some friends that I haven't talked to in a long time. But I feel like I failed to answer something that we brought up, which is, what if you have a friend who's not taking this seriously enough? And if it's okay with you, I just wanted to quickly address that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's something called like the dread equation that we all carry around in our heads. And it's how we make risk assessments when we encounter some possible threat, right? And it's a official term, dread, but you can kind of feel it, right? Like, is something really dreadful or not? So plane crashes, high dread, right? Car crashes, low dread, even though, obviously car crashes are way, way, way more dangerous. So so if you know someone who's either feeling too little dread or too much dread, then you can tweak the ingredients that go into dread, or you can try to, right? And I really do think of it as a sort of equation. So some of the things that go into the dread equation are whether something is um, like imaginable, like whether you can imagine it happening, maybe because you've seen it in movies, maybe not. This would be a case where if someone was not seriously, and someone in their town died of the coronavirus, then that would be something you'd want to leave open on their screen, right? Like that's the kind of thing where a salient, to your point, like as someone who works in film, particularly TV, like video is a much more emotional medium. So for people on the other extreme who are feeling too much dread right now, maybe people who had a lot of anxiety before or other things, they should not be watching TV news, full stop, at all. Like not online, not on TV, nowhere. In fact, I wouldn't even listen to the radio. Like it's just not helpful to do because it's just much more emotional. If you want to, it's good to stay informed, read the news, you put on a 10-minute timer and read a news source that you trust, but reading is just radically, radically better than at this moment for lowering the emotional dread level. So the things that go into dread are the uncontrollability of a threat, the unfamiliarity of it, the imaginability of it, the amount of suffering involved, right? So if something feels like there's going to be a lot of suffering, like cancer, as opposed to like a heart attack in our heads, cancer seems like a lot more suffering. The scale of destruction. So we're much more upset about a bus crash that kills 50 people than 50 separate car crashes, right? And also unfairness. And this is a really big one in a pandemic. So if something feels unfair, like the doctor who tried to get attention about coronavirus in China, the fact that he died is really kind of brutal, right? To process. And so those kinds of things do amp up our dread equation. So in a perfect world, we would all kind of like take an online test and see if our dread level is just right, and then we could adjust. But like, it's hard to know until later.
Coronavirus test and a dread level test. We should be making both of them.
Probably we could get the dread level test out sooner.
Yeah, true. Well, I'll let you go because you do have a social closening obligation.
So thank you. Thank you.
Some people are busier than normal with their social, which is kind of nice to see. Yes, hopefully we retain some of that. I mean, this has been amazing. Honestly, like I said, you're a guest who I've been I've been waiting to reach out to, and this felt like the right time. But I am determined to get you on a more standard episode where we talk about something not at all about this. I loved your book, The Smartest Kids in the World. which was about comparing educational systems all over the world. And you spent time in Poland and was it Korea, South Korea?
Yep. Finland.
And Finland, which was a fascinating book. And now you're working on something new, which was, does it have a title yet? Your new project?
The working title is High Conflict, but we still have to argue about it for a while. So.
Well, that's part of what your book is about. So High Conflict, which is about how to get out of or getting out of intractable conflicts and how one might do that. So Amanda Ripley, I'm a huge fan and a huge fan of your writing, and be well, be safe. I will hopefully see you, because I very much, social distancing is a little difficult for me. This stuff is fun, but I actually like doing all these things in person. So I'm dying to get back out in the world again, and I'll come visit you down in DC or wherever you are, and we'll do this again.
I look forward to that, Jay. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for doing this, and I look forward to being able to see you in person someday soon.
Yes. All right. Be well. Take care, Amanda.
All right. You too. Take good care.